Do you have from the industry attending as well?
Yeah, we do have some, yeah. Okay, Prof, we are starting now.
Okay, yeah. Just let me share the screen later. Yeah, okay.
Yes, Prof, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Nabi al-Amin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin amma ba'd. Distinguished online guests, my dear brothers and sisters, and our respected guest speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Syed Musa bin Syed Alhabshi. Welcome back to our weekly English lecture on issues of board Sharia committee interaction in governance of IFI. And Islamic Economics Association of Kuwait University is pleased to welcome you all to our activities, programs, lectures every day in a week, more than 12 programs, more than 21 programs in every week in both Arabic and English language. So this is how Islamic Economics Association is trying to spread Sharia compliant finance models and strategies and some practical modules by international figures and scholars of Islamic banking and finance. And we usually organized programs and lectures in English language, which usually covers a wide range of Islamic banking and finance, Islamic microfinance, insurance, capital market, equity market, and also features and Sharia principles of Islamic finance, nature of contracts, products, and services provided by the Islamic financial institutions and also Islamic banking. And our lectures and talks are also on some specific topics like sukuk, retail, corporate banking, fintech, and debt and wealth management, and governance, and many more other contemporary issues that we are covering in our lectures. So today we would like to welcome our Associate Professor Dr. Syed Musa bin Syed Jaafar Alhabshi, Associate Professor at the IIUM, Institute of Islamic Banking and Finance, International Islamic University, Malaysia. Dr. Syed Musa has served as a Dean of IIUM Institute of Islamic Banking and Finance and has held various academic positions since February 1994, including Head of Accounting Department at IIUM, Head of Postgraduate Islamic Banking and Finance in International Islamic University, Malaysia, Head of Center for Postgraduate Studies in UNITER, in Malaysia, Dean of Faculty of Business Administration in UNITER, and also Dean of Graduate School of Business in Uni Razak in Malaysia. As an academic, he served both public and private universities for over 30 years, period of teaching, research, and supervision of postgraduate students in accounting, business administration, and Islamic banking and finance. In both taught master programs and also professional programs and doctoral programs. As an academic and trainer, he conducted numerous local and international workshops on accounting, audit, governance, and risk in Islamic finance, organized by both financial authorities and agencies globally, such as in UK, Dubai, Hong Kong, Maldives, Jeddah, Singapore, Brunei, Jakarta in Philippines. So this is our privilege to have Associate Professor Dr. Syed Musa bin Syed Jaafar Alhabshi to conduct today's lecture on issues of board Sharia committee interaction in governance of IFI. So I would like to welcome Dr. Syed Musa to deliver the lecture and to conduct this session. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahidin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Welcome.
And thank you to the Islamic Economic Association for inviting me again. I think previously, in the previous lecture, I talked about governance, management, and administration from a very general broad. So this second invitation, I try to be more focused to some specific current issues. Maybe let me just share my slides first. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? Yeah? No?
Yes, Prof. Yes.
Okay. Let me just try to put it to full screen. Yeah. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi washabihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I think good afternoon to you, and it's coming to good evening in Malaysia at 5 p.m. This topic, actually, I have presented to a board of directors in a Takaful company when they request me to look at some issues. And here I present again. So you will see some Malaysian-centric examples or Malaysian-centric regulation, but I think this can still be applicable and we can relate to the global scene. Yeah, because I believe, as you're aware, when we introduce Sharia governance, in addition to corporate governance, there have been more questions than answers. How do these actually relate to each other? And what are in terms of the background to it and how it has developed? Let me just move to my outline first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover both corporate and Sharia governance in system and principles. Then I will look at some specific requirements, right? Now, these requirements actually came from legislation, also came from standards. And from these legislations and standards, we try to understand the environment, how governance actually operate. And then I will also touch a little bit about some of the distinguishing features in terms of corporate and Sharia governance. Of both, of course, are trying to achieve the same common objective when you talk about governance. But to be more specific, we realize that the roots of this, where it came from, which ideas, and how it has evolved, and the issues that even facing corporate governance today, despite the fact that we do as much requirements, but we still have problems with corporate governance. So now with Sharia governance, all right, will we actually have the same problems, or are we having different types of problems? At the same time, what are the issues? So I feel that it's good for us to examine them side by side and do some comparative analysis and see how we can find some kind of an optimal solution to this governance framework models as well as mechanisms. Then something that I would like to introduce about mindsets, about how we think, what is our attitude, what is our belief, what is our value system. Do the Sharia committee and the board, do they have the same mindset or they have different mindset? Is it just an intersection? That means is there something common, or is there a convergence? All right. Especially when we talk about a landscape of different types of financial institutions, all right? Different types of financial institution, different level of complexity, as well as the institutions that are conventional, offering financial services, which are Islamic products, or full-fledged Islamic financial institutions, and so on. So we got various models in different jurisdictions and different practices, but still relying on, to a certain extent, the same broad governance principles. All right. So what sort of mindset are we going to have? Yeah. And then, of course, what sort of perception or expectation in terms of performance and delivery gaps. Yeah. So what kind of value assurance that we expect, and whether these are met. So these are some of the points that I hope we can deal within maybe 45 minutes or 1 hour. I hope there could be questions and answers and discussion. Then, of course, when we talk about the goals of the firm itself and Maqasid al-Sharia as the ultimate overall overarching goal of Sharia itself, how do we match this? Yeah. And finally, of course, the need for potential strategies for goal convergence. Right, now when we look at corporate governance, all right, it will bring us to the Bank of International Settlement, 2015 document. I mean, this is as far back I just like to share. Of course, we have also the OECD, but I'm just bringing you to the financial sector. And then we have here the objective. The primary objective of corporate governance should be safeguarding stakeholders' interests in conformity with public interest on a sustainable basis. So we already bring in the concept of sustainability here, not only of the perpetual organization, but also the ecosystem and the environment. And then among stakeholders, particularly with respect to retail banks, shareholders' interest should be secondary to depositors and policyholders' interest. So ultimately, the protection, the customer protection for the depositors, in the case of banking, and policyholders in the case of insurance are specifically mentioned. Of course, there are, if you go into this document, there are about 13 principles. Now, I'm not going to go into the 13 principles. What I'm going to give you is basically a diagram just to elaborate some of these principles. So we have principles that relate to setting the bank strategies and objectives, how the bank wants to go about. So basically, not only the objectives and strategy, but also the risk appetite. When we talk about governance, we are not just talking about compliance, we are also talking about audit assurance, we are also talking about risk management. So there are actually quite a mouthful of things that we talk about. Then, of course, how do you supervise the personnel? All right, so again, here we have to look at what kind of personnel. All right, of course, we have staff, line function, we have those that are expert or specialized in certain area, and those that are general. And then later on, when we talk about Sharia governance, we have also the Sharia unit or the Sharia department. And then, of course, the banking operations, as you know, whether this is basically dealing or is it the banking activities, the core banking activities. Now, at the same time, we cannot ignore the stakeholders' interest. Now, this has, of course, been sort of, it has resonated. It has made quite a significant voice in terms of who they are and how we take care of it. At the same time, there is a need to establish control functions. So you will see that just looking at this very basic sort of component diagram, there are some key elements that we need to focus on. But more important is today, as we talk about corporate governance, the word corporate culture keeps coming back. Okay. Previously, we spent a lot of time talking about the structure and the process. But where is the soul of this organization? So the soul finally rests on the values, and the values are reflected in shared beliefs and values, and these shared beliefs and values becomes culture. Now, if I go specific to the Malaysian scenario, all right, we have specific guidelines, all right, and we do not go very far away from the international documents, and we have to also deal with it. Now, we also make reference to IFSB corporate governance, which I'm going to come back later. So here, corporate governance is defined as process and structure, all right? So it has to be a determinable structure and process. Now, usually when we talk governance, we do not ignore regulation. We develop governance in lieu of the regulation. Of course, regulation focus more on supervision, but governance focus more on transparency and market discipline in many respects, all right? So then, of course, what do? We direct the business affairs of the institution to enhance the business prosperity and corporate accountability. Now, this, at the end of the day, to enhance or to achieve long-term shareholder values while taking account the other stakeholders' interests. Then, of course, we go on to further elaborate in terms of how this relate to the BIS guideline and how do we achieve in terms of who are the key responsible persons, okay? So whether we like it or not, there are at least the two groups of people who are, number one is the board of directors, The other one is the senior management, or we call them the C-suite, all the CEOs, COOs, CTO, and so on. Then, of course, the financial institution, of course, corporate governance represent a fundamental component. So when we talk about the financial authority, the corporate governance has got to be in place. I think this is all we understand. At the same time, there is a certain level of supervision, and the level of supervision intensity depends on the strength of governance. So it is relatively interrelated. The more stronger, the more mature the governance, the less will be the need for supervision. Hence, it goes back to the board's competence, confidence, and objectivity. Now, when we look at the guiding principles of corporate governance for specific institutions, for example, like Islamic Insurance, Takaful, and so on, we can see IFSB 3. Okay, you can also look at IFSB specifically on corporate governance in general. Here, I just want to highlight some specific references. Now, you'll notice that the comprehensive governance policy framework will have to embed what we call good governance culture. All right, so what is this good governance culture? Now, we have here to set out the strategic roles and functions of each organ of governance. So when we talk about the organs of governance, all right, which are critical to any organ governance framework, we will have the board of directors and various board committees, which are the sub-board committees. We have the executive management, we have the Sharia supervisory board or the Sharia council, and then we also have the internal external auditors. Right. Some of the key I would say, members, yeah. Then, of course, the mechanism of this accountability for each organ of government. To what extent this mechanism actually operates in such a proper and effective manner. Now, if we refer to IFSB 10, Sharia governance system, all right, the Sharia governance system will refer to us in terms of the arrangements, in terms of the components of the institutional and organization, and in terms of now, this issue of independence is crucial because we want to whatever Sharia rulings, whatever Sharia are properly executed. Yeah. So issuance of Sharia pronouncements and resolutions, that will be one item. Dissemination of the information, right? And then there should be an internal Sharia compliance or review, right, which will be the control function, followed by, of course, an annual Sharia compliance review and audit to verify the internal Sharia compliance. So you see these four components are peculiar and, of course, important when you talk about the Sharia governance system. Now, the issuance of Sharia pronouncements and resolutions, sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's external, all right? But the challenge will be, how do you disseminate this? Okay, how do you ensure that the communication gets through, that the information is understood, all right? Now, I do have experiences when in Sharia committees, you know, you send out an email and you ask about compliant activity or Sharia compliant activity, unless the whole organization understand and appreciate, you will not be able to actually identify the Sharia issue until it happens, all right? So by the time it's a bit too late. Yeah, but if we have proper training, proper understanding and support, we can actually anticipate. That's basically the fundamental of risk management. Then when we talk about Sharia review and audit, I mean, we still have questions like how different is Sharia compliance review and how it is with audit. In simple terms, okay, of course, this one will require a much more detailed treatment. When we talk about compliance review, we focus very much on the Sharia requirements. All right, because once you put in compliance, it has a legal dimension to it. All right, and the practice now in Malaysia is this compliance review is no more with the Sharia unit, it is with the compliance department under the chief compliance officer. So it has sort of integrated already within that function. All right, rather than putting it separate as under the Sharia. Then, of course, when we talk about the audit itself, the focus will always be on the assurance, the focus is on the controls, all right? So again, where do we put Sharia audit? Right? Do we put it under the Sharia department or do you put it under the audit department? Right? So some of these key functions or control functions, all right, we have to go back to what it is and how it's best conducted. Unless we need to give a new interpretation, right? However, having said that, the Sharia compliance review and Sharia audit still need to be guided by the Sharia committee. Right? Although finally that, for example, the Sharia audit will go back to the audit committee because the audit will look at the whole audit plan of the bank. Now, this brings me to the question of should we still have Sharia audit or should we just move on to Islamic bank audit? All right, and then it becomes more integrated. All right, but this, of course, I give it back to the Sharia scholars, the Sharia community, because the term evolved from that ecosystem, that environment. Then, of course, the annual Sharia compliance review and audit for verifying the internal Sharia compliance review report and so on. So this becomes a regular event, and not only the Sharia committee is supposed to do it, but also the board. So to what extent is board involvement? I think this is the question that we ask. Then when we look at some core principles, now here I just want to highlight for those in Takaful, because usually we tend to be very much on banking. We have terms like tabarru', we have terms like ta'awun, and so on. To what extent do we actually understand this? To what extent do we operationalize this? And to what extent is this reflected, especially when you talk about the takaful surplus and so on? All right. So the same thing when we talk about the investment account in the case of banking, right? Because a special section is dedicated when we talk about FSB about the importance of the investment account. Now, a lot of mutations and innovation have taken place. And in the case of Malaysia, we have this concept of investment account platform, all right, and value-based intermediation. So we are trying to re-engineer again to give the full potential of mudarabah, for example, or the social aspect of investment itself, or socially responsive investment in this kind of arrangement. Now, today, as we talk about takaful and insurance and the calamity that we face, the crisis that we face, especially with COVID, to what extent do we respond differently, and to what extent do we actually give sufficient support, right? So conventional insurance business, of course, involves the element of riba, so is banking. And how do we deal with this when we talk about compliance, as depending on the models that we have constructed? Okay, next I'm going to go a little bit to some of the technical documents that we have, which is the IFSA. Now, IFSA is actually the Islamic Financial Services Act. This is 2013. So now it's already almost 9 years. So I think 10th year, we should have a look at it again and review. The SGP is actually the Sharia governance policy document. This was actually introduced 2010, we reviewed 2014, and then we have 2019. Now, these two documents, especially in Malaysia, one is a legislation, a statute, the other one is a policy document from the central bank. It has significant impact on corporate and Sharia governance, in terms of compliance as well as how it should be done. And we have specific sections within that, or it tells about who's having the power, where the committee acts on, and the authority and the scope, as well as the audit. So all this is laid out. So the act itself details out specific sections, all right, and not only in terms of compliance, but in terms of the role of governance itself. Yeah. Then when we talk about the corporate governance and Sharia governance, we can make some variation here, right? Now here, I think this one I should make some changes here. It should be SGP 2019. My apologies. So the relevant sections that we look at, the need for approval for who is the chairman, the directors, and so on. Now, one thing that I need to highlight here, when we talk about licensing, all right, licensing of the financial institution always goes back to the financial authority. So to a significant extent, it will fall under the Islamic Financial Services Act. Otherwise, you will just focus on the Financial Services Act. Then, of course, the role of the board of directors, what they are expected to do. So the board leadership, when we talk about the board leadership, I'm not referring to management, the board leadership, the need to provide direction, the need to provide oversight is a crucial point that we have to consider in terms of governance. So generally, they have to ensure and oversee effective design, not only the plan, but design and implementation of sound internal controls, compliance and risk. Now, when we move to Sharia governance, all right, then we realize that there are specific sections that are also specified on Sharia governance within the Act, all right? So for example, the functions and duties of the board of directors, in relation to Sharia compliance. So Sharia compliance is not only the role of the Sharia committee. Okay, we have made sure that the board has got to take direct responsibility, right? So previously, when the board say, okay, we just leave it to Sharia, they advise and then we act on it. But now we see the board. So now the board has got to be involved. So if the board has got to be involved, how is the role of the board in relation to the Sharia committee? Now this brings a lot of questions. Personally, myself, I have sat in both, and I can tell you it's quite difficult to wear two hats, yeah? Because actually, which one are you representing at any point in time? However, most of the time we end up reducing or reconciling any views and getting a better understanding from both sides, whether from the Sharia or from the board. And then, of course, the fit and proper requirements on the disqualification of who is the Sharia committee, who is not. And as you know, Malaysia has also went for provided certifications to ensure that those, even you are trained in Sharia, but you are also familiar with the other question. Yes, Ibrahim, Ahmad, you raise your hand, please, if you have a question. I see you raise your hand. Can you hear me, Ibrahim? Yeah.
Oh, I think you already lowered the hand.
Oh, okay, lowered already. But if you have a question, I can.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
No. So I continue, yeah? Okay.
Yes, Prof. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So here you will notice that any other matter in relation to business. Now, previously, the Sharia committee will say, okay, I just look at Sharia issues. I don't have to look at the business issue, all right? The business issue, we leave it to the board. That was the initial perspective. But then when you have Sharia discourse or Sharia discussion that affect the business issue, especially the sustainability of the business or the growth of the business, then you have to engage. So now the Act has also specified that any other matter in relation to business for the purpose of compliance with Sharia, the Sharia committee has got to be involved. So of course, here the internal policies and procedures on Sharia governance are consistent with the standards, all right? So here I just want to highlight that although we have SGP, but the Act itself also addresses Sharia governance, not only just corporate governance, yeah? Now, this is just a diagram that I just want to share with you in terms of the primary role of the board of directors, all right, which I think all of us are aware, except that now it extends the scope of the board of directors, does not just limit to the business as usual. Now there are Sharia issues which they have to be cognizant, they have to be aware. In some of the banks that I sit in, even a foreign bank, the chairman of the Sharia, the chairman of the board also sits in the Sharia committee, all right, just to listen and understand our deliberation, all right, so that when he goes back to the board, he can share with the board. Of course, we have representative from the Sharia committee to also go to the board and share with the board, right? So in that sense, you have a much closer engagement, closer interaction, okay? And a better understanding of the workings, because sometimes you just give a view, but how did that view arise? What were the considerations? What were the issues? And what was the discussion? Then, of course, we have the typical acting in good faith and bona fide or bona fide, exercise reasonable care, due care diligence, which is expected. Now, the fit and proper requirements, for now, it is standard, but later on, I believe we're going to have changes, especially when you are taking and looking at the peculiarities of Islamic financial institutions. And then, of course, proper execution of the comfort powers by virtue of the Act. And then, of course, their functional roles. So here, I just want to highlight in bold that due regard to any Sharia committee decision or any Sharia relating has got to be taken into consideration by the board. So at the same time, the safety and soundness, and the sustainability. Now here I put takaful participants. If you look at banking, it will be referring to the depositors. So whatever it is, you'll notice that the role of the board now doesn't just focus on the business, they also have to focus on the Sharia, and the bulk actually stops at the board, all right? Because they make the final decision, yeah? Now, when we look at the board and Sharia committee, we have the primary role and duties of the board, and also the primary role of the Sharia committee members. So we have the same requirements to focus on Sharia. We have to observe what internal policy and procedures. Now this has came up quite recently. Previously, when we talk about Sharia requirements, usually we refer to Sharia resolutions, we refer to Sharia standards, we refer to the central bank Sharia advisory committee, but we also now look at the Sharia compliance manual, the SOPs, the standard operating procedures. Now, whatever that is pronounced, whatever that has been endorsed by the Sharia committee now become an important document to make reference to compliance. Yeah, so compliance is much broader than just statute or policy guidelines. It also includes internally generated documents. Okay. So when we talk about the information that is to be provided, whether to external parties, right, in this case customers, policyholders, and so on, or internal, it must be properly vetted. It has to be accurate, complete, and not misleading. Now, in some ways, you will see that the challenge has increased. Now, previously in a typical banking relationship, right, we limit the kind of information that we provide to our depositors or our customers because the transactions are very much loan or interest-based and rather impersonal. But once you enter into contracts like ijara, musharaka, mudaraba, there's a lot of information that need to be disclosed, information to be shared to understand how profit sharing is being derived and so on, because the risk is there. So all this now becomes a responsibility in terms of communicating not only the approval or the permissibility, but also the validity of the transactions to a significant extent, depending on whether we are referring to the product disclosure sheet or we are referring to the contracts and so on, or the legal doc. Okay, now I go to the Sharia governance policy document. So we have guidance for the board of directors, also guidance for the Sharia committee. You may say, well, Sharia governance policy document actually just focus on Sharia governance. Actually, there's also an element of corporate governance. So when you talk about the board of directors, then it is the responsibility of the board to establish this Sharia governance framework. Of course, it varies with the size. If it is a small outfit of the Islamic banking, then it has to be suited, or if it is very extensive, it has to be addressed relatively. Yeah. And of course, the board's oversight, accountability over Sharia governance and compliance must reflect this integration. All right. So what do you mean by this integration? All right. So in other words, you cannot be anything, at least, if I put it at the end of the scale, it should not be contradicting. You should not conflict. But the best will be there should be some kind of congruence. That means common shared values. Okay. But the least will be it complies with all requirements. Now, for the Sharia committee, for example, they must have a charter that sets out the mandate, responsibilities, and procedures of the Sharia committee. So Sharia committee has got to work on a certain mandate. Now, this mandate will obviously come from the board, all right, or at least endorsed by the board. The Sharia committee can decide what they want to do, but it has to be communicated to the board in some way. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem between communication between the board and Sharia committee, right? Now, whatever it is, we have to go back to what is the structure of the governance of that particular jurisdiction and the process, right? So that we can look at it carefully and effectively. Yeah. Now, the Sharia committee, of course, is to provide objective and sound advice to the advice to ensure, look at this, aims and operation, business and affairs. So it just doesn't have to limit to Sharia, but it has to understand the operation, business and affairs, as well as activities of the institution. Okay, let me just put this together. So we can see that the primary role, all right, the functional role, and further elaboration of the functional roles in terms of the board of directors within Sharia governance. So more intense, more requirements relating to Sharia is being put on the board as far as Malaysia is concerned. All right. Whether this is good or not, this is what we will see as we review from time to time. But one thing that we do realize that most of the institutions, especially the one with subsidiary Islamic banks, I mean, it's a group, it's a bank, but it has conventional, it has Islamic, there is a greater concern as well as emphasis of the board of directors involvement. Now we have at least two level boards. We have the board at the holding, we have the board at the subsidiary. The board at subsidiary, of course, is more proximate. It will be able to appreciate. And some of them will be representative of the board in the main board. Okay. So yes, they may. So we may have communication issues along the way. And some of these need to be addressed. So it became specifically highlighted, especially in 2009, that they have to oversee the implementation and decisions. So it just doesn't stop to the Sharia committee. So the senior management got to make sure that the board is satisfied. And then, of course, the sound corporate culture, which runs across. So now we can see that Sharia governance and corporate governance is expected to be more integrated. Right? So what do we mean by sound corporate culture? Of course, we are referring to both corporate governance as well as Sharia governance. All right. Now, there's also another important point here about end-to-end compliance. Yeah. So if you take a simple product development process, all right, from the conception of the idea right up to implementation, and then later on the settlement if it is financing or the returning of the deposits. Now, this whole process end-to-end have got to be checked, which means if that institution is reporting to the head office and they have a lot of shared services, we have to run through an audit to make sure that this whole process is properly and effectively taken care of. Right? So the same thing with the Sharia committee. Yeah? So the Sharia committee, we also specify in the Sharia governance in terms of their responsibility. So here is an interesting observation. If you look at the board, they act as oversight. They provide direction, they provide oversight. But the Sharia committee here is to provide objective sound advice. So the approach taken in Sharia governance policy in Malaysia is more advisory rather than to be in full control. So who has the full control? It is the board. Okay. But the Sharia has got to give the advice. Now, we also have a clause to say that if there are differences, the Sharia committee can disagree and go direct to the central bank, right? If it cannot be reconcilable. And it can happen, and this provide independence to the Sharia committee. So to say whether the Sharia committee actually report to the board or they just advise the board and it's up to the board to pick it up, all right, we have to understand. But as you can see here, the Sharia committee must establish a robust methodology to guide the decision process. Okay, so now there is a lot of emphasis in terms of the methodology to reflect the independence of the Sharia view, all right, to reflect the robustness of their thought process. Now, this will enhance the integrity of the Sharia opinion within the governance framework. Within the Sharia, I think we don't have issues because you have all the methodologies, all the ijtihad approaches that you have. There's no issue. But within the governance framework, okay, within the governance framework, it has to be seen independent and actually act independently, and it achieves what its function is. So again, it has to also address the issue of safety and soundness of the financial institution. So it is not just left to the board. The Sharia committee also has to take. So all this convergence or intersection that the Sharia committee must be concerned about the business, the board must be concerned about Sharia, brings about the need to review how the interaction can be effectively addressed. So this is where I'm going to come to, which is the interactions with the Sharia committee. So specific guidance is given to the board that they must give due regard to the decisions and advice of the Sharia committee. They cannot just say, oh, we have just noted, or just call the Sharia officer to just brief the board. All right. Certainly, it takes a much more engaging role with the Sharia committee. And of course, these are further details, what kind of facts, rationale, basis, and so on. So they have to be aware of this. and also to give fair considerations of the implications. And if there is any conflict, there must be a conflict resolution mechanism, all right? It has to be documented, how it is resolved, and so on. And finally, the deliberations. So all these are happening actually, and all these are being taken into consideration. So now we take very seriously the interactions between the board and the Sharia committee, and how it has to be properly documented, and how it has to be properly conducted, in many respects. So if we go back to the primary role of the board, all right, and how it has to fulfill this role, okay, I have given you quite a list of information here, which I've extracted from IFSA, right? So to give attention to the facts, and to put in conflict resolution mechanism that I've highlighted earlier, and the further details in terms of effective communication, allocation of sufficient resources. We do have challenges like the Sharia committee is a very skeletal team. I'm talking about the Sharia Secretariat. The Secretariat is the one that supports the committee, very skeletal. And then they have to do the training, they have to do the research, they have to do the monitoring. So you're not sure whether this is sufficient enough, this is sound enough. So there must be continuous engagement to ensure that they are properly supported with sufficient resources. And then when we talk about communication, there's always the issue of language. All right, this is not just the language of the Sharia and the conventional, but it is also about the language of the operational terms. All right, so that it transcends the organization, that everyone understands. Because otherwise, we're going to have assumptions, and some of these assumptions subject to being tested can be problematic. Okay, so this is some of the things that I've said, and except that now I put it more specific in terms of what are the areas, what are the operating processes, and then what are the reporting arrangements that have got to be specified. So in terms of remuneration policy, in the Malaysian scenario, the board decides the remuneration of the Sharia committee. All right. In some jurisdictions, we bring the Sharia committee to the board level, which means it goes straight to the assembly or the annual general meeting. So it depends on the model, we can look at it. In Malaysia, it's very much looking at just as a committee, but of course, the Act gives maximum support and also independence to the Sharia committee. Okay, now I want to go into something a little bit behavioral, all right? So that we can sometimes ask questions like, why is it that things do not happen, or why there could still be gaps, all right? So I call these mindsets, right? So if I'm going to put the core values and try to peel it as an onion, right? I have what we call the board mindset. I have the industry safety and soundness, which is concerned, the central bank or any financial authority always say we have to be safe and sound, all right? And then you have the Sharia mindset. Now, if I put the board mindset, okay, first we start with the vision, and from the vision, of course, you come with the mission statement, and from the mission, the strategic options, and from the strategic options, you have the risk appetite. Then finally, you have the performance and growth, and then sustainability. Now, this will always be at the back of the mind of the board, all right, from vision right up to the sustainability of the organization or achieving sustainable development goal. But when we look at the Sharia mindset, then what do we have? Okay, so we have the issue of permissibility of the activities, all right, and the issue of validity of the transaction. These were what we were very preoccupied at the beginning, because it takes a lot of effort to even structure a product and to make sure that this product has got valid contract, at the same time achieve its purpose in terms of its product features and so on. Then, of course, we have to go to the next step, which is fair dealing with mutual benefits, all right? So this again goes back to information asymmetry or symmetry between the parties, and whether there's sufficient disclosure, all right? It goes back to product disclosure and so on, and especially if you work with an agency, whether the agency is aware. Then, of course, if we go into maqasid Sharia, all right, then there will be higher goals. What will that be? One will be, of course, equity, in terms of the parties and the relationship, and the other could be social legitimacy. I'm not limiting the diagram, I'm just putting some ideas here for us to discuss. And I certainly welcome if you've got other ideas, which I have not included because this is non-exhaustive. So but what I believe is we need to explore the mindset. What is the thinking? What is the view? What is the motivation? What is the attitude? So that we can help to converge and address this. Yeah. But generally, this is what I could just put in a diagram first. Then, of course, we have to reconcile the perception as well as the expectation in terms of the performance gap. So a perception gap, of course, occurs when information assessment of policy document not properly or effectively communicated or adopted by institution. So when we say, for example, there is a Sharia issue, all right? Is this Sharia issue understood by the board? All right. Is this Sharia issue actually understood by the auditors? Is this Sharia issue understood by the compliance, for example, or even the risk? Okay. To what extent? What are the dimensions? Right. So if that information is not adequately assessed, all right, then we may misclassify it, or we may exclude it. We may even ignore it, because we thought it is not important, but later on it may surface again. Then, of course, the issue of how do we reduce this gap, all right? At the end of the day, there could be multiple approaches, all right? But there should be a shift from just compliance to shared values. And of course, finally, to social orientation, because we're just talking about social legitimacy, yeah? I mean, there is always a concern about the welfare the Islamic bank provide. So these are basically some of the thought processes when you want to reduce a perception gap, all right? So it's not just looking from one perspective, you may have to look from a few. It could be qualitative, it could be quantitative in your approach, all right? So there could be also experimentation, all right, to actually confirm this is the policy, what it meant, and how it should be interpreted, and how it should be implemented. So it will then, we hope to improve what we call stakeholder interaction experience, all right, in terms of expectation. Then, of course, I just want to highlight how a document like ACCA, an organization like ACCA, did mention about this gap, especially when we talk about the professional requirement, whether is it an evolution gap, knowledge gap, quality gap, misperception gap, or methodology gap, or a delivery gap. So there could be different gaps at different stage of implementation, and we have to see this, all right? So at the original, for example, when you come up with the product concept, all right, everybody seems to agree, but they all have different assumptions. By the time you put it to the risk department, you get an entirely different story. When you bring it to the accounting department, we have an entirely different story. I give you a simple example, all right? When you adopt IFRS in your reporting, what happens? You have one standard that covers all, which is the financial instrument standard. So financial instrument standard basically try to standardize the economic consequences of all products and services. Now the question is, will it be sufficiently to capture, all right, the Islamic transactions or Islamic financial transactions and its consequences? Now these are some of the questions that we keep coming back, all right, because the processes sometimes differ, the documentation also need special attention and so on. So certainly, it is not as straightforward, and we have to come back and look at it, okay? So some of the view says that, well, whatever gap that you're talking about, it is at the end of the day, the delivery, okay? Have we delivered value to the customers? Have we developed value to the shareholders? Have we delivered confidence and assurance to the public about the Islamic aspect of the institution, okay? Do I take the questions now or later? Because I see some questions and answers in the chat box.
Yes, Prof. Okay. There is a question from Ibrahim Ahmed. How do we manage compliance and shared value when the value in question is not Sharia compliant?
Again, sorry?
How do we manage compliance and shared value when the value in question is not Sharia compliant?
Okay, very interesting question, yeah? So we have to go back to the source, all right? The source of the compliance in terms of the compliant requirement and the source of the shared value. Now, I feel this, I believe this is a possible scenario, all right? It's not impossible, especially if you migrate from a conventional to an Islamic, okay? So you may have shared values, all right, which is conventional in nature, but now you are migrating to an Islamic value, yeah? Let me give you an example, and maybe some of you can help me with the solution. When a bank gives a loan, all right, when a bank provides loan and facility, is the bank expecting the customer to return the money as soon as possible, or the bank expect the customer to continue the loan as possible until maturity, so that the full interest income can be accrued, right? So what do you have? The latter, right? In other words, you want to give the full facility and for the possible income. Now, what about the Islamic value? What is the scenario? Right? Do we expect the same, or do we make some modifications to address? And if we do we communicate? Okay. So obviously, we will strike to the core of banking business itself. Okay. What was it? Was it more on the loan capital, or was it more on the human interaction, the human support, and the facilitating of the financing or funding activity, which became more of a priority? Of course, we have concepts like partnership banking and so on, or ethical banking, which slowly moves, right? And gives that, in fact, there is also the socially responsible banking. There is a document on that, which applies to conventional, ethically responsible banking. We can see there is some convergence there. So certainly, yes, there are values which came from one source, and then the requirement came from another. So we have to look at it carefully. Now, the challenge is when you have to pay penalties because you did not comply. But certainly this does not add value to the shareholders, all right, nor does it give confidence to the customer. So certainly it has to be reconciled. I hope I respond to that question.
Yes, Prof. Thank you, Prof.
Okay. Never mind. I mean, we can still have more after this. So coming back to articulating the board and Sharia interaction gap, all right? So first we look at the documents. In this case of Malaysia, we have the IFSA and the Sharia governance policy. And then, of course, we look at the relationship between the board of directors and Sharia committee, because now we have established that both documents affect both the Sharia committee and the board. Okay. Right? So it's not just the IFSA governance only for affecting the board, it's also affecting the Sharia committee. So in that sense, the corporate governance aspect also applies to the Sharia committee, not just the Sharia governance. Then we have the management, and then we have the investor policy stakeholder. Now, if we have this perspective, then obviously we say there must be interaction. They cannot work in silos. And management will have to play a very crucial role to help build the culture, all right? Because both of them, the boards, they only meet maybe quarterly, and they come as oversight, the other one to advise. So they won't play a very significant role to shape the organizational culture as much as the management, all right? So the management now become critical. Then, of course, you have the issue of perception gap in terms of the document when you want to implement, in terms of the interpretation. There could be mutual expectations gap between the board and the Sharia committee because of their background, because of their roles and functions that may need to be addressed. And there could be a delivery gap, all right, that is to be provided to the investors, policyholders, and stakeholders. So all these three gaps has got to be addressed. So sometimes we can just solve the perception gap, then the rest will fall into place. Sometimes the perception gap is already clear, there is already training, a lot of seminars, and then basically relooking at the draft and formulating the policy. But then there's still the behavioral and mutual expectations. I mean, should I still be thinking about the business, or should I just leave it to the board, let them, because they have the final say, or the Sharia committee should? Where do we find the balance? Where do we find the line? And then finally, both will have to deliver. All right. So Do we do it in an integrated reporting, or do we have separate reporting? All right. So, and will this reporting will be confusing, or this reporting should be providing assurance? I think these are the questions that we need to ask. So if I go from the typical institutional theory or institutional perspective, we go back to what is the goal of the firm and what will be maqasid. How can we find some common? So I just took Ibn Ashur's definition here: preservation of order, achievement of benefit, prevention of harm or corruption, establishment of equality among people. Because of his background as administrator, as I read his biography, I found his discussion on maqasid Sharia is very much appealing to people who are in this area of governance. Of course, you have the Shatibi philosophy of law and so on, but I found this, and I find this helpful in many respects to relate. So it became so operational and functional to relate to the goals of the firm, which is value creation, preservation, sustainability, maximization. Now we talk about social responsibility, legitimacy, and so on. All right. So if we bring this to maqasid, then obviously we would be singing the same tune, and we'll be looking at the same perspective. So obviously, the board of directors and Sharia committee have got to play a complementary role, and to a certain extent integrated. But it has to be guided by the goals of the firm, and it has to be directed to maqasid Sharia. All right. Now, how we do it, of course, then it goes back to the mechanisms, the structure, the processes. Yeah. Right. So some need for potential strategies. Yeah. So the perception gap, if any, in terms of design, acceptance, adoption, and implementation of Sharia principle, ruling, and opinions, all right, could be harmonized. So when we talk about harmony, means reconciliation, reducing differences, trying to find a balance. All right. Now, once we do that, then we can see that the organization will not have a conflict or will have a constraint, but rather will be very motivated and directed to whatever goals. And then there could be also the need to minimize the expectation gap in terms of the adoption, monitor, and review of the implementation of Sharia decisions. So this can be reduced if there are more engagements, or more, not necessarily more, I would say more value engagements, all right, that if you meet, the issues are clarified and effectively discussed. Yeah. Then integrated reporting. I mentioned about integrated reporting. It's not something new. Integrated reporting has been in the literature in financial reporting, except that it is very much focused on shareholder value in many respects. Let's make it broader to stakeholder value and give special focus on Sharia. Then we can open up. So this could, inshallah, reduce the delivery gap. So the three gaps that I talked about, the perception gap, expectation gap, and delivery gap, there could be some kind of formulation of solutions in this kind of strategies or direction. Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, I hope I've used the time well for 1 hour. Yeah, and I pass it back to Chair. Unless we have questions, let me look at the chat.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Right, maybe Chairperson would like to highlight any matters that for further discussion, please.
Yes, so we now open the floor for question and answers. Yeah, we appreciate any question or comment from the online guest. You may raise your hand, or you may write your question in our question box. We still have about some more times. So we appreciate any questions or any additional point if our guest would like to add.
If I may ask, so what is the scenario like in Kuwait? Are there developments of this interaction between board and Sharia committee in the institutions in Kuwait, for example? Yeah.
Yes, Prof.
Yeah. Do you have a more engagement now between the Sharia and the board, or you have already integrated the Sharia is represented in the board?
Actually, I don't have a proper idea about Kuwait.
Okay.
I do have in Bangladesh, but I think if someone from Kuwait would like to share.
Yeah.
Musa Harun, I think the thing is about certificate. Yeah, about certificate, please you may write to us via email, our email, official email, or you can also directly download the certificate from our website. If you go to our website, then you can fill up the form, the program that you join, and it will automatically come out, inshallah, from the website. Any more question? I think, Prof, or you have any idea, any more additional point that you want to share? Otherwise,
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a concluding remark. This process of governance is always an ongoing, and it is good if we have a platform where we can share experiences across jurisdictions, right? And we can learn from each other more, because there are a lot of cultural factors, yeah, that can either expedite or enhance a governance, and we cannot just rely on one Anglo-Saxon model, yeah, to fit all. We seem to be relying very much on the European or the American model, but we can actually regenerate our own models that could be more suited to governance of IFI. That's my last comment. Allah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think Brother Ibrahim Ahmed would like to say something.
Yeah,
Brother
please.
Ibrahim, yes, please. Yes, Brother Ibrahim Ahmed. I think there's something wrong. ممكن تزويدنا بالمطلع العلمية. Yes, so we put already our slides in a Google Drive form in the chat group. You can also download from this chat group. We'll also upload it in our official Facebook page and Twitter, so you may find slides there as well. And this lecture also is recorded in our YouTube channel of Nadal Iqtisad Islami. Okay, okay, Prof. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
Our online guests, dear brothers and sisters from around the world, we'd like to thank you very much for joining us today in this auspicious session. And our thanks go to management board, especially our brothers and sisters in Nadal Iqtisad Islami for their effort, and especially our Dr. Alal Ubaid, who is the Director General of the association. And our lastly, we would like to thank from our bottom of heart to our Associate Professor Dr. Syed Musa for your time and your effort. And we sometimes would like to disturb you and take your time for the benefit of the people in this field. So we thank you very much, Prof, for
Thank you very much. And Ramadan Kareem, inshallah.
Ramadan
Soon, next Ramadan Kareem, inshallah.
Ramadan Mubarak.
Mubarak, yes.
So we thank you very much, and we'll see you again, inshallah, very soon.
Inshallah. Right.
And with that, we conclude today's session here. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you, bro.
سعيا لخدمة طلبة العلم والارتقاء بمستوياتهم، يسر نادي الاقتصاد الإسلامي الإعلان عن منصة مدارج لإصدار الشهادات، بوابة خاصة لكل طالب، إمكانية التحقق من مصداقية الشهادات، إمكانية تغيير الاسم. كيف تعمل المنصة؟ بعد حضورك إحدى المحاضرات التابعة لنادي الاقتصاد الإسلامي، يقوم النادي بإنشاء حساب شخصي لك، ثم تصلك رسالة إلكترونية عبر البريد تحتوي على رابط المنصة. اسم المستخدم كلمة المرور. قم بالضغط على رابط المنصة، ثم أدخل اسم المستخدم كما هو موضح في الرسالة، وأيضا كلمة المرور. ثالثا، اضغط على شهاداتي. بعد الدخول إلى لوحة التحكم الخاصة بك، قم بالضغط على شهاداتي. هنا سوف تظهر لك جميع الشهادات الخاصة بك. بإمكانك الضغط على تحميل لتحميل الشهادة. كما يمكنك تعديل الاسم بالضغط على تعديل الاسم الكامل وكتابة الاسم الصحيح. انتبه، يسمح لك بتعديل الاسم الكامل مرة واحدة فقط. الرجاء التأكد من كتابة الاسم الصحيح. بعد ذلك قم بالضغط على حفظ. كما يمكنك تعديل كلمة المرور وإدخال كلمة مرور قوية. تم تسجيلك في منصة الشهادات بنجاح. مرحبا وأهلا بك في منصة مدارج الخاصة بشهاداتك في نادي الاقتصاد الإسلامي. شارك الآن وارتق معنا بسلم عضويات النادي. نادي الاقتصاد الإسلامي، التأصيل والتميز.